Yeah, now I want to turn to an example from literature. I've got a selection from William Shakespeare from Romeo and Juliet. And this example will be complementary to the case from the history of science that we just looked at, the Semmelweis case at the University of Vienna Medical Hospital here. Now, the point here is to illustrate the general epistemological issues about human cognition and its developmental issues, as well as the complicated interplay of all of those developmental skills by the time we are mature adult learners here. As human beings, we need to observe the world well, to classify and conceptualize the world well, to be able to form complex sentences and propositions, and then to take all of that and integrate that into narratives and theories that understand the world. All right, so let me start here by reading you a short scene from Romeo and Juliet. This is from Act 2, Scene 2. In the earlier scene, Romeo has been hanging out with his two friends. He's a teenage boy in love with Juliet. You know the context of the story here, but the immediate background is that his two friends have, in the tradition of teenage boys the world over, been teasing him somewhat unmercifully about his falling in love with a girl, and at the same time Romeo is very serious about his love affair, and so he's decided he's going to go off, leave his friends, and see whether he can catch a glimpse of Juliet that evening before he has to head home himself. So, Scene 2 from Act 2, Romeo kind of over his shoulder, leaving his friends, saying to them, "He jests at scars that never felt a wound." And then Juliet appears at a window above him, and his whole demeanor and voice changes, right? "But soft. What light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou her maid art more fair than she. Be not her maid, since she is envious, her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off." All right, so I'm not a Shakespearean actor, but nonetheless, this is a powerful piece of prose, and what I want to do is use it as an illustration of the epistemological themes that I've been developing here, starting with the obvious point that for us to be able to understand, let alone appreciate, prose like this, a whole array of complicated cognitive skills have to be taught, learned, and automated. Starting from the fairly obvious point of observation, which is first on our list on the board here. Students need to be able to observe, in this case a sheet of paper, and to learn to attend to the difference between the black and the white, to learn that the black is what carries the information in this case, that the white of the pages is merely background. Further observational issues come into play in learning all of the particular letters, being able to observe very carefully, right, the differences of the shapes, in some cases very subtle differences in the shape, the difference between the H and the N, between the I and the J and so forth is somewhat subtle in many cases. So then to be able perceptually to discriminate all, in the case of English, 26 letters of the alphabet, and then of course to memorize them. Having learned, supposing we're learning things through the phonics method here, all of the individual letters, to then start classifying them to see how those particular letters are integrated into words that stand for abstract concepts. He, jests, at, scars, that, never, felt, wound. Right, so all of those individual words, right, are grouped there. Partly it's an observational issue here. It's not he jests at scars, right? It's not all run together. There are spacing issues that we need to observe in the course of figuring out where the words break and the next word begins. And then, having figured out all of the words and knowing the meanings of all of the words in this case, then being able to integrate all of the words individually into a sentence or a proposition. He jests at scars that never felt a wound, right? And to be able to understand that as an integrated unit, that's the propositional form. Then, of course, here Shakespeare has a whole narrative structure. Here we have perhaps 8, 9, or 10 sentences in this little passage that I read to you here, to see it as having a beginning, a flow, and an end, to be able to integrate all of those sentences into a unit. That's this particular speech by Romeo, and to be able to understand it as a narrative structure here. Okay, all of that's fine. Complicated, takes a long time to have a child cognitively developed enough to be able to do all of that. I picked this selection though because it adds a couple of levels of complexity here. One is obviously the Shakespearean language from our 21st perspective is historical language in some respects, and so some of it has an archaic feel to it. And so there's an issue of learning the historical meanings and the historical shadings, and being able to stretch our cognitive apparatus to the point of being able to understand concepts and formulations in a broader historical context here as well. But more significantly, I chose this passage rather because it involves a very sophisticated use of figurative language. And what I want to do is focus on the metaphor, the central metaphor in this particular passage, and show again how it involves understanding the metaphor involves a complex interplay of all of the sophisticated cognitive apparatuses that hopefully we have developed by the time we are adult learners ourselves. The central metaphor in this case here is the Juliet is the sun metaphor. Romeo says Juliet is the sun. Obviously, if we take that simply literally, it's meaningless. So it's a figurative use of language, in this case, a metaphor. And so part of interpreting this passage and coming to understand it and then hopefully appreciate it is being able to be comfortable with metaphors as they come along, to be able to fairly fluidly and fluently figure out what they mean and see the way in which they add a richness to the narrative here. So, putting this in language that is evocative of the Semmelweis case study, if we were to ask the question, suppose we're in an educational context here, you're the teacher, I'm the student, and you've put the question to me now that I've read this passage to you in class. All right, Stephen, what exactly does this passage mean? You read the line, Juliet is the sun. What does that mean?